Sometimes the heaviest burdens we carry aren't the ones we can see. For 20 years, old Obadiah Crane has lived alone in the Wyoming mountains, haunted by the memory of his wife and daughter, who died in a fire he couldn't prevent. Now a painful growth on his knee is getting worse each day, and he's ready to let it take him. He's tired of fighting, tired of living with the guilt. But during a fierce storm, something incredible happens. The growth suddenly bursts open and, instead of what he expected, a glowing stone with strange markings falls out. The stone seems to pulse with its own light, and that night Obadiah begins having the most vivid dreams of his past he's ever experienced. What is this mysterious object, and why did it choose him? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun crested the jagged peaks of the Wind River Range, casting long shadows across the weathered timber of Obadiah Crane's cabin. At 58, he moved with the deliberate care of a man who had learned that haste brought nothing but heartache. His hands, gnarled from decades of mountain living, wrapped around a tin cup of coffee as he stood on the narrow porch that overlooked the valley below. 20 years since he'd climbed these heights, seeking nothing more than distance from the world and the weight of his failures. The cabin sat perched on a natural shelf of granite, surrounded by towering pines that whispered secrets to the wind. It was a simple structure, 2 rooms, a stone fireplace, and windows that framed the endless expanse of wilderness stretching toward the horizon. Obadiah had built it himself, log by log, during those first bitter months when grief threatened to consume him entirely. Every nail driven, every chink filled with mud and moss had been an act of survival rather than creation. The work had kept his hands busy when his mind threatened to spiral into the darkness of that terrible night in Cheyenne. Sarah. Even now, her name came to him like a prayer whispered in the quiet moments before sleep. Sarah Morrison, the banker's daughter who had somehow seen past his rough exterior to the gentle heart beneath. She had been 22 when they married, her auburn hair catching sunlight like spun copper, her laugh bright enough to chase away the shadows that seemed to follow him even then. He walked to the wooden crate beside his bed, where he kept the few precious things that remained from his old life. Inside, wrapped in a piece of faded blue calico, one of Sarah's dresses, lay a simple gold wedding band. He held it up to the morning light streaming through the window, remembering how it had looked on her slender finger, how she would twist it unconsciously when she was thinking. "Papa, why do you always look so sad when you hold Mama's ring?" The memory of little Beth's voice struck him like a physical blow. 6 years old, with Sarah's bright eyes and his own stubborn chin, she had possessed a wisdom that seemed far beyond her tender years. He could still see her clearly, pigtails bouncing as she ran through their small house in town, always asking questions, always seeking to understand the world around her with the fearless curiosity of the very young. They had lived simply but happily in those days. Obadiah worked as a blacksmith, his strong arms and steady hands earning enough to keep his small family comfortable. Sarah tended their garden and took in sewing when money grew tight. Beth played with her wooden dolls and listened wide-eyed to her father's stories of his younger days riding with the cavalry. It had been a good life, a quiet life, the kind of life that made a man believe he understood his place in the world and the boundaries of his happiness. Then came that October night in 1863 when everything changed. He had been working late at the forge, finishing a set of horseshoes for the Reverend's mare. The work had taken longer than expected, and by the time he banked the fire and gathered his tools, full darkness had settled over the town. He remembered hurrying home through the empty streets, eager to find Sarah and Beth already asleep, warm and safe in their beds. Instead, he found flames licking at the windows of their small frame house. Even now, 2 decades later, the memory burned through him with undiminished fury. He had rushed toward the house, shouting their names, but the heat drove him back again and again. Neighbors appeared from nowhere, forming bucket brigades, but the fire had already taken hold with a hunger that seemed almost alive. He had tried to break through the front door, then the back, but the flames were everywhere. The roof collapsed, just as the volunteer fire brigade arrived, and with it went any hope of reaching the two people who meant more to him than his own life. They told him later that the chimney had cracked, that sparks had caught the curtains Sarah had sewn with. Such care. They told him it wasn't his fault, that there was nothing he could have done, but Obadiah knew better. He should have been home earlier. He should have checked the chimney himself instead of trusting the lazy mason who had claimed it was sound. He should have been there to save them. The guilt had eaten at him through the long months that followed. Friends and neighbors tried to comfort him. The preacher spoke of God's mysterious ways, but nothing could fill the hollow space where his family had lived in his heart. Finally, unable to bear the pity in people's eyes and the constant reminders of his loss, he had sold everything he owned and headed for the mountains. That first winter had nearly killed him. He knew nothing about surviving in the wilderness, and his grief made him careless with his own safety. More than once, he had considered simply walking out into a blizzard and letting the cold finish what the fire had started. But something, stubbornness, perhaps, or the faint echo of Sarah's voice telling him not to give up, kept him alive through those dark months. By spring he had learned to trap and hunt, to read the weather in the behavior of animals and the color of the sky. He had also learned that solitude, while painful, was preferable to the well-meaning sympathy of others. The mountains didn't judge him or offer empty consolations. They simply existed, vast and indifferent, requiring nothing from him but the will to survive another day. Over the years, he had established a routine that gave shape to his exile. He rose before dawn, tended to his small garden, checked his traps, and maintained the cabin against the constant assault of weather and time. In the evenings, he read from the handful of books he had brought with him, mostly the Bible and a collection of Shakespeare's plays that had been Sarah's pride and joy. The nearest town was Millbrook, a 2-day ride down treacherous mountain paths. He ventured there perhaps 3 times a year to trade furs for supplies, speaking only when necessary and avoiding the curious stares of townspeople who had heard stories about the hermit of Eagle Peak. Doc Brennan was one of the few people who made any effort to maintain contact with him. The gruff Irish physician had been making his rounds through the mountain communities for longer than anyone could remember, and he insisted on checking on Obadiah whenever his travels brought him near. Their conversations were brief and practical, mostly about minor injuries or the inevitable aches that came with age and hard living. But Obadiah found himself looking forward to these rare visits more than he cared to admit. Young Tommy Bridger from the valley occasionally brought news or supplies when the winter snows made travel impossible. Tommy was the son of a rancher who had settled in the lower elevations, a good-hearted boy of perhaps 16 who seemed immune to the sadness that surrounded Obadiah like morning mist. He would chatter about events in town, the weather, his father's cattle, anything that came to mind, filling the cabin with a youthful energy that reminded Obadiah painfully of better times. Now, as he stood in the doorway watching the sun climb higher, Obadiah felt the familiar ache in his right knee intensify. The growth had been troubling him for months, starting as a small, hard lump beneath the skin. At first, he had dismissed it as nothing more than an old injury making itself known. He had taken a bad fall from his horse several years back and landed hard on that leg. But the lump had grown steadily larger and more painful, until now it throbbed with every step he took. Last night, during the worst storm he had seen in years, the pain had become unbearable. He had collapsed beside his bed, gasping and clutching. At his knee, as lightning split the darkness outside and thunder shook the cabin's foundations. He had made his peace with death long ago, accepting it as the inevitable end to a life that had lost its purpose when the flames took his family. If this growth, this tumor, as Doc Brennan would surely call it, was meant to be his final companion, then so be it. He was tired of fighting, tired of carrying the weight of his guilt and loneliness through each passing season. But then something had happened that defied all rational explanation. In the midst of his agony, as the storm raged overhead, the growth had suddenly burst open like an overripe fruit. Instead of the blood and corruption he had expected, something extraordinary had spilled forth, a stone unlike anything he had ever seen. The object was roughly the size of a robin's egg, smooth and warm to the touch, with strange symbols carved into its surface. Most remarkable of all, it seemed to glow with an inner light, pulsing gently like a beating heart. The pain in his knee had vanished the moment the stone emerged, leaving behind only smooth, unmarked skin where the growth had been. Obadiah had spent the remainder of the night staring at the impossible object, turning it over in his weathered hands, trying to make sense of what had occurred. The symbols meant nothing to him. They appeared to be neither English nor any of the native languages he had encountered during his cavalry days. Yet something about them seemed familiar, as if they spoke to a part of his mind that existed beyond conscious thought. When exhaustion finally claimed him near dawn, his sleep had been filled with dreams more vivid than any he had experienced since childhood. He had found himself standing in the parlor of his old house in Cheyenne, watching Sarah move about her daily tasks with the grace that had first captured his heart. Every detail was perfect. The way sunlight fell across the wooden floors, the scent of bread baking in the kitchen, the soft rustle of her skirts as she passed. Beth had been there too, laughing as she played with a wooden horse he had carved. For her 7th birthday, her small hands guiding the toy through elaborate adventures across the braided rug. In the dream, Obadiah had tried to speak to them, to warn them somehow, but no words would come. He could only watch, filled with a bittersweet joy at seeing them again, knowing even in sleep that this gift was temporary. Now, holding the mysterious stone in the morning light, he wondered if his long isolation had finally driven him to madness. Perhaps the tumor had affected his mind before it burst, creating elaborate hallucinations to ease his passage into death. Yet the stone felt solid and real in his palm, its gentle warmth spreading through his fingers like sunshine. He moved to the old pine chest beside his bed and withdrew Sarah's ring once more. As he held both objects, the simple gold band and the glowing stone, something remarkable happened. The faint scent of wildflowers filled the air, so real and immediate that he turned toward the door, expecting to see Sarah's ghost standing on the threshold with her arms full of prairie blooms. But there was no one there, only the mountain wind stirring the branches of the ancient pines. Still, the fragrance lingered, bringing with it memories of their courtship, when he would pick bouquets of Indian paintbrush and mountain lupine to bring to her father's door. Obadiah closed his eyes and felt, for the first time in 20 years, something that might have been hope stirring in his chest. Whatever this stone might be, miracle or madness, it had given him back his family for a few precious hours of dream. If that was all it could offer, perhaps it would be enough. Outside, the morning stretched ahead with its familiar routine of survival and solitude. But something fundamental had shifted during the night, like a compass needle finding true north after years of wandering. The stone pulsed gently in his palm, warm as a promise, bright as the memory of love that refused to die. The storm had begun 3 days ago, as nothing more than dark clouds gathering along the western peaks. But by evening, it had grown into something fierce and primal. Wind howled through the canyon below Obadiah's cabin like the voices of all the ghosts he carried, and rain lashed against the windows with increasing fury. Thunder rolled across the mountains in long, booming echoes that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. Obadiah sat hunched in his wooden chair beside the fireplace, his right leg extended awkwardly to ease the throbbing in his knee. The growth had swollen to nearly twice its previous size over the past week, the skin stretched tight and hot to the touch. Each pulse of pain seemed synchronized with the lightning that split the darkness outside, as if the storm were somehow connected to his suffering. He had stopped pretending that this was merely an old injury, making itself known. The lump beneath his skin had taken on a life of its own, growing with a persistence that spoke of something far more sinister than bruised bone or torn muscle. Doc Brennan had warned him about such things during his last visit. Tumors, he called them, growths that fed on a man's life force until there was nothing left but pain and slow decline. Stubborn old fool, Obadiah muttered to himself, echoing what he knew the doctor would say if he could see him now. Should have come to town months ago, but what would have been the point? Even if Brennan could remove the growth, and that was far from certain in this wilderness. What then? Another few years of solitude and regret? Another 2 decades of watching the seasons turn, while the best parts of him remained buried beneath the ashes of his old life? The pain struck again, harder this time, driving him to his knees beside the chair. He clutched at his leg, gasping as fire seemed to spread through his bones. Outside, the storm reached a crescendo of fury, lightning illuminating the cabins. Interior, in stark, flickering moments. Thunder crashed so close that the dishes rattled on their shelves, and dust sifted down from the rafters. Through his agony, Obadiah became aware of something else. A strange pulling sensation, as if invisible. Hands were drawing him toward the far corner of the cabin. Fighting against the pain, he managed to crawl across the rough wooden floor to where Sarah's old trunk sat beneath the single window. The trunk contained the few personal belongings he had salvaged from their house after the fire, mostly damaged items that held no value to anyone but him. He rarely opened it, finding the memories too painful to bear, but now something compelled him to lift the heavy lid, despite the screaming protest from his knee. Beneath layers of carefully folded fabric, Sarah's dresses, Beth's tiny shoes, a patchwork quilt that had covered their marriage bed, his fingers found the edge of something hard and unfamiliar. With trembling hands, he drew forth a leather-bound journal he had never seen before. The book was old, its cover cracked and weathered, bound with strips of rawhide that had darkened with age. But it was the symbols pressed into the leather that made him catch his breath. The markings were identical to those he had glimpsed in his fevered dreams. Strange, flowing characters that seemed to shift and dance in the firelight. Another wave of pain crashed over him, and this time it brought with it a sound he had never heard before, a deep, resonant crack that seemed to come from within his own body. He looked down at his knee in horror and saw that the skin had begun to split along the top of the growth, revealing not blood, but a soft, pulsing light. "God in heaven," he whispered, his voice lost beneath another crash of thunder. The crack widened, and more light spilled forth, illuminating the cabin's interior with an otherworldly glow. The pain reached unbearable intensity, then suddenly vanished completely, leaving behind only a profound sense of release. With a wet, tearing sound that made him queasy, the growth burst open like a seed pod, and something small and warm fell into his outstretched palm. The object was unlike anything he had ever seen, roughly oval in shape and no larger than a bird's egg. It appeared to be made of some kind of translucent stone that pulsed with its own inner light. The surface was covered with the same mysterious symbols that adorned the journal, etched so finely that they seemed to have been carved by divine hands. As he stared at the impossible object, the storm outside began to subside. The wind dropped to a whisper, the rain gentled to a soft patter against the windows, and the thunder rolled away toward the eastern peaks. In the sudden quiet, Obadiah could hear his own heartbeat and the soft crackling of the fire, but beneath these familiar sounds was something else. A low, musical humming that seemed to emanate from the stone itself. With shaking fingers, he opened the ancient journal. The pages were covered with writing in the same strange script, accompanied by detailed drawings of plants, animals, and celestial patterns. But as he stared at the incomprehensible text, something remarkable happened. The symbols began to shift and rearrange themselves before his eyes, transforming into words he could understand. The journal belonged to someone named Standing Bear, a medicine man of the Shoshone people who had lived in these mountains long before white settlers arrived. The entries spoke of sacred stones, 7 in total, that had been hidden throughout the territory to preserve ancient wisdom for future generations. Each stone was said to possess the power to heal the deepest wounds of the human spirit, but only for those who truly needed such healing. Standing Bear had been the guardian of this particular stone until his death some 30 years earlier. According to the journal, he had hidden it within the very walls of the cabin, weaving protective spells around it until the right person came seeking redemption. The stone would remain dormant until called forth by genuine suffering, the kind of soul-deep anguish that could not be healed by ordinary means. Obadiah read by the stone's gentle light as the storm continued to fade outside. The medicine man's words painted a picture of spiritual healing that went far beyond physical ailments. These stones, he wrote, were doorways to the realm of memory and forgiveness, allowing the bearer to revisit the past, not to change what had been, but to understand it differently. "The man who comes after me," one passage read, "will carry a burden too heavy for mortal shoulders. The stone will know him by his grief and call to him in his darkest hour. If he has the courage to accept its gift, he will find that love transcends even death, and that forgiveness begins with oneself." As if responding to the words, the stone in Obadiah's palm grew warmer. The light within it pulsed more rapidly, and suddenly the air around him shimmered like heat waves rising from sun-baked stone. For just a moment, he could have sworn he saw Sarah standing beside the fireplace, her hair loose around her shoulders, her eyes bright with the love he remembered. She smiled at him, that gentle, knowing smile that had always made him feel like the most important man in the world, and mouthed words he couldn't quite hear. Then the vision faded, leaving him alone with the journal and the impossible stone that had emerged from his own body. Outside, the last of the thunder rumbled away into the distance, and stars began to appear through breaks in the clouds. Obadiah sat in his chair holding the stone, feeling its warmth seep into his bones and chase away the chill that had lived in his heart for 20 long years. For the first time since that terrible October night, he allowed himself to believe that perhaps his story wasn't over after all. Perhaps there were still chapters to be written, still chances for healing and redemption in a life he had long considered finished. The stone pulsed gently in his palm like a beating heart, and Obadiah Crane prepared himself for whatever strange journey lay ahead. Dawn came slowly to the mountains, painting the eastern peaks in shades of rose and gold that reminded Obadiah of Sarah's favorite shawl. He had dozed fitfully in his chair throughout the night, the glowing stone cradled in his palm, afraid that, if he let it go, the entire experience might prove to be nothing more than a fever dream brought on by pain and desperation. But the stone remained real and warm against his skin, its gentle pulse as steady as a sleeping child's breath. The mysterious symbols carved into its surface seemed to shift subtly in the changing light, sometimes appearing to spell out words in languages he had never learned, other times forming patterns that spoke to something deeper than rational thought. His knee, where the growth had been, showed no sign of the previous night's trauma. The skin was smooth and unmarked, as if the tumor had never existed at all. When he pressed his fingers against the spot, he felt no pain, no tenderness, only the natural give of healthy flesh over bone. Standing carefully, Obadiah was amazed to discover that his entire leg felt stronger than it had in years. The persistent ache that had plagued him through countless mountain winters had vanished, leaving behind a vitality he had almost forgotten he possessed. He took a few experimental steps around the cabin, marveling at the absence of the stiffness that had become his constant companion. The journal lay open on the table where he had left it, its pages still clearly readable, despite being written in a language that should have been incomprehensible to him. By morning light, Standing Bear's account seemed almost mundane, the careful notes of a scholar recording his observations of the natural world. Only the occasional reference to spirit stones and doorways of memory hinted at the mystical. Events that had unfolded in this same cabin 3 decades earlier. Obadiah prepared his usual breakfast of coffee and cornbread, but for the first time in years, the simple meal tasted rich and satisfying. It was as if the stone had awakened senses that had been dulled by grief and solitude, allowing him to experience flavors and textures with the intensity of a man discovering food for the first time. As he ate, he studied the journal more carefully. Standing Bear had been remarkably thorough in his documentation, including detailed drawings of the stone at various stages of its mystical activity. One sketch showed it glowing brightly while surrounded by what appeared to be ghostly figures. Another depicted it floating above a circle of other objects, a feather, a piece of carved bone, some dried flowers. It was the flowers that caught Obadiah's attention. He rose from the table and moved to his Bible, a worn leather volume that had been his father's before him. Between the pages of the Book of Ruth, he had pressed the wildflowers Sarah had worn in her hair on their wedding day, Indian paintbrush and mountain lupine that had long since faded to brown, brittle remnants of what had once been vibrant with color. Now, as he opened the book, a sweet fragrance filled the air. The pressed flowers, which had shown no sign of life for 20 years, suddenly seemed to glow with a faint inner light. Their colors had returned, not the full vibrancy of living blooms, but a soft, ethereal beauty that made them appear almost translucent. Obadiah's hands trembled as he touched one of the delicate petals. It felt warm beneath his fingertip, and, for a moment, he could have sworn he heard Sarah's laughter echoing from the far corner of the cabin. The sound was so real, so immediate, that he turned expecting to see her standing there with her arms full of fresh flowers, ready to arrange them in the blue ceramic vase that had been her pride and joy. But there was only empty space and the morning light streaming through the windows. Still, the sense of her presence lingered, filling the cabin with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the hearth. That evening, as darkness settled over the mountains, Obadiah prepared for sleep with a mixture of anticipation and fear. The previous night's dreams had been more vivid than any he could remember, but he wasn't certain he was ready for whatever revelations the stone might bring. The grief he carried was an old companion, familiar in its weight and contours. What would he become if that burden were lifted? He placed the stone on the small table beside his bed and lay down fully clothed, unwilling to risk losing track of the mysterious object, even for the few moments it would take to undress. The last thing he saw before exhaustion claimed him was the gentle pulse of light emanating from the stone, casting shifting shadows on the rough-hewn walls of his sanctuary. The dream began as gently as a spring morning. He found himself standing in the church where he and Sarah had been married, sunlight streaming through tall windows to illuminate the simple wooden pews. She was there beside the altar, radiant in her mother's wedding dress, her face glowing with happiness as she waited for him to join her. But this was not the ceremony as he remembered it. Instead of the nervous young man he had been, Obadiah approached the altar with the wisdom and experience of his 58 years. He could see the challenges that lay ahead for this young couple. The struggles with money, the difficulties of starting a family, the small disappointments and larger joys that would shape their life together. Yet none of it seemed cause for sorrow. Instead, he felt overwhelmed by gratitude for every moment they would share, even knowing how it would end. The fire that would take them was still 13 years in the future, and those years would be filled with love and laughter and the simple pleasures of a life lived together. Sarah looked up at him as he reached her side, and her eyes held depths of understanding that seemed beyond her 22 years. "You've been blaming yourself for something that hasn't happened yet," she said softly, her voice carrying the musical quality he remembered so well. "But blame is just another kind of prison, my love. And prisons are meant to be opened." He tried to speak, to tell her how sorry he was, how he should have been there to save her and Beth, but she pressed her finger gently to his lips. "There are no mistakes in love," she whispered, "only chances to love more deeply." The dream shifted, and suddenly he was in their small house on a snowy December evening. 6-year-old Beth sat on his lap before the fireplace, listening with rapt attention as he told her stories of brave knights and beautiful princesses. Sarah worked at her sewing nearby, occasionally glancing up to smile at her husband and daughter with an expression of perfect contentment. This, too, was a memory, but transformed by the stone's magic into something richer and more meaningful than the original experience had been. He could see now what he had missed then, the way Sarah's needle paused in its movement when Beth laughed, how her eyes softened with love as she watched her family's simple happiness. When Obadiah woke the next morning, his pillow was damp with tears, but they were not the bitter tears of regret he had shed for 20 years. These were tears of recognition, of finally understanding that the love they had shared was not diminished by loss but made eternal by it. The third night brought dreams that cut deeper than healing, visions that forced Obadiah to confront the darkness he had carried for 2 decades. He found himself once again standing outside his burning house in Cheyenne, but this time, the stones. Power allowed him to see the scene with terrible clarity. He watched his younger self pound frantically on the door, heard his own voice calling Sarah and Beth's names until it cracked with desperation. But now he could also see what he had missed in his panic, the way the neighbors had risked their own safety trying to help, how quickly the volunteer fire brigade had assembled despite the late hour, the genuine grief in people's faces as they realized the tragedy unfolding before them. Most painful of all, he could see through the windows into the smoke-filled interior of the house. Sarah had awakened first and tried to reach Beth's room, but the hallway was already impassable. She had died trying to get to their daughter, just as he would have done. There had been no time for rescue, no moment when his earlier presence could have changed the outcome. The fire had spread with a speed and ferocity that would have claimed them regardless. Obadiah woke from this vision racked with sobs, the stone clutched so tightly in his fist that its edges cut into his palm. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to grieve not just for what he had lost, but for the futile guilt he had carried. The weight of that misplaced responsibility had shaped every day of the past 20 years, and now it was crumbling like a dam finally giving way. To the pressure behind it, he rose before dawn and walked to the old pine chest where he kept Beth's few remaining belongings. Among them was a small silver locket he had given her for her 6th birthday, shaped like a compass rose, with delicate engravings around its edge. She had treasured it, wearing it every day until the night she died. As he held the locket in the morning light, something extraordinary happened. The tiny compass needle within began to move, but instead of pointing north, it swung steadily toward the east, the direction of Cheyenne and the graveyard where his family lay buried. He turned the locket in his hands, testing this impossible behavior, and watched the needle maintain its orientation no matter which way he faced. The implications made his heart race. If the locket was somehow connected to Sarah and Beth's resting place, then perhaps their spirits were not as distant as he had believed. Perhaps the stone was creating bridges not just to memory, but to something far more profound. His contemplation was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats on the narrow trail that led to his cabin. Quickly, he tucked both the stone and the locket into his shirt and stepped onto the porch. A familiar figure was making his way up the steep path, young Tommy Bridger from the valley, his horse picking its way carefully among the loose rocks. Tommy was 16, with the easy confidence of youth and a genuine warmth that had slowly worn down some of Obadiah's defensive walls over the past 2 years. The boy's father, William Bridger, ran a modest cattle operation in the lower elevations and had been one of the few people to treat Obadiah with simple human decency rather than curiosity or pity. "Morning, Mr. Crane," Tommy called out as he dismounted near the cabin. "Pa sent me up to check on you after that fierce storm we had. Thought you might have lost some shingles or had a tree come down." Obadiah studied the young man's face, searching for any sign that he might have noticed the strange lights that had emanated from the cabin during the stone's emergence. But Tommy's expression held only the usual mixture of respect and mild concern that characterized their interactions. "Storm passed without doing much damage," Obadiah replied, his voice rougher than usual from the previous night's emotional upheaval. "Roof held fine." Tommy nodded, but his eyes remained fixed on Obadiah's face with unusual intensity. "You look different somehow, Mr. Crane. Healthier, if you don't mind my saying so. That old limp of yours seems better too." The observation sent a chill of alarm through Obadiah. If Tommy could see the physical changes so easily, how long would it be before others noticed? The last thing he wanted was attention from curious townspeople, or, worse yet, from the kind of people who might view a miraculous healing as an opportunity for profit or exploitation. "Been eating better lately?" he said, forcing casualness into his tone. "Doc Brennan's always after me to take care of myself." "Speaking of which," Tommy continued, "there's been some odd talk down in the valley. Folks saying they saw lights up on the mountain during the storm. Not lightning, but something else. Strange colors dancing around up here. Of course, people see all kinds of things during bad weather, but it had some of the old-timers spooked." The stone seemed to pulse against Obadiah's chest, as if responding to the mention of discovery. He kept his expression neutral, but inwardly he cursed himself for not considering how visible the supernatural light might have been from below. "Mountain storms can play tricks on the eyes," he said carefully. "Probably just lightning reflecting off the wet rocks." Tommy appeared to accept this explanation, but Obadiah could see that the boy's curiosity was far from satisfied. They talked for another few minutes about mundane matters, the weather, the condition of the trails, Tommy's plans for the coming winter. But throughout the conversation, Obadiah felt the weight of scrutiny after Tommy left, promising to return. In a few weeks, with supplies, Obadiah sat on his porch and contemplated the implications of what had just occurred. The stone's power was apparently not something that could be easily hidden. If people in the valley had seen the lights during its emergence, how many others might have witnessed similar phenomena? And what would happen when word of his miraculous recovery inevitably spread? He pulled the locket from his shirt and watched its needles swing toward the distant graves of his family. The compass rose had become something far more significant than a simple gift to a beloved daughter. It was now a connection to the spiritual realm, a tangible link between the world of the living and whatever lay beyond. That evening, as he prepared once again for the stone's nocturnal revelations, Obadiah found himself facing a choice he had not anticipated. The healing power that flowed through the mysterious object was already beginning to transform him in ways that others could perceive. Soon, he would be forced to decide whether to retreat deeper into isolation to protect his secret, or to risk exposure by continuing to engage with the outside world. The stone pulsed gently in his palm as darkness fell over the mountains, and Obadiah realized that his journey toward redemption would require far more courage than he had initially imagined. The change in Obadiah's daily routine began subtly, almost without his conscious awareness. For 20 years, he had moved through his mountain sanctuary with the careful deliberation of a man whose body carried the accumulated aches and limitations of hard living. Now, as the fourth day since the stone's emergence dawned clear and bright, he found himself stepping outside with an energy that belonged to a much younger man. His morning inspection of the cabin's exterior, a ritual born of necessity in this harsh environment, revealed storm damage that would have taken him the better part of a week to repair in his previous condition. Several shingles had been torn loose by the violent winds, and a large pine branch had fallen across the path to his water source. Yet as he gathered his tools and set about the work, Obadiah was amazed to discover that tasks which once left him exhausted and sore now seemed almost effortless. It was while splitting wood for the winter's supply that he first noticed the walking stick. He had carved it himself during his second year on the mountain, fashioning it from a sturdy willow branch that had survived a lightning strike. The wood was seasoned and hard, worn smooth by years of use, and had served him faithfully through countless miles of mountain trails. Now, as he leaned the stick against the woodpile while he worked, something caught his eye. Along the length of the weathered willow, tiny green buds had begun to appear, impossible signs of new growth on wood that had been dead for decades. He picked up the stick and examined it more closely, running his fingers over the small protrusions that seemed to pulse with their own faint vitality. The stone in his shirt pocket grew warm, as if responding to his discovery. When he drew it forth and held it near the walking stick, the transformation accelerated before his eyes. The buds swelled and opened, revealing delicate leaves of the brightest green he had ever seen. Within minutes, the entire length of the stick was adorned with fresh willow foliage that rustled softly in the mountain breeze. "Impossible," he whispered, but the evidence of his senses could not be denied. The stone's power was not limited to healing human ailments. It could restore life to anything it touched, breathing vitality into even the most unlikely subjects. His wonderment was interrupted by a sound that made him freeze in place, the soft step of hooves on the rocky trail below his cabin. But these were not the familiar sounds of Tommy Bridges' horse, nor the measured pace of Doc Brennan's old mare. This animal moved with the quiet grace of a creature unaccustomed to human presence, picking its way carefully through the underbrush. Obadiah slipped the stone back into his pocket and moved quietly to the edge of the clearing. What he saw there filled him with both awe and concern. A magnificent white-tailed deer, a doe with large, intelligent eyes, stood at the forest's edge. But something was wrong with the animal. Her left foreleg hung at an awkward angle, clearly broken, and dark stains along her flank suggested other injuries as well. The doe regarded him without fear, which was unusual in itself. Mountain deer were typically skittish creatures that would bolt at the first sign of human presence. Instead, this animal seemed to be studying him with an almost human intelligence, as if she somehow understood that he possessed the power to help her. Moving slowly so as not to startle her, Obadiah approached the injured creature. She remained perfectly still as he knelt beside her, her dark eyes fixed on his face with an expression that seemed to convey both pain and hope. When he gently examined her broken leg, she made no effort to pull away or flee. The stone grew warm against his chest, and without fully understanding why, Obadiah found himself drawing it forth once more. The moment the glowing object came into view, the doe's ears pricked forward with interest rather than alarm. It was as if she recognized the stone for what it was, a source of healing power older than human civilization. Obadiah held the stone close to the deer's injured leg, and immediately the familiar pulse of warmth began to flow through his hands. The animal's breathing, which had been quick and shallow with pain, gradually slowed and deepened. Before his amazed eyes, the crooked angle of the broken bone began to straighten, and the dark stains on her flank faded as torn flesh knitted itself back together. The healing process took perhaps 10 minutes, during which neither human nor animal moved. When it was complete, the doe rose gracefully to her feet and tested her weight on the previously broken leg. Finding it sound, she turned to look at Obadiah one final time, and he could have sworn he saw gratitude in her gentle eyes. Then, with a fluid bound that spoke of perfect health and vitality, she disappeared into the forest. Obadiah remained kneeling in the clearing for a long time after she was gone, staring at the stone in his palm and trying to comprehend the magnitude of what he had witnessed. The object's power was far greater than he had imagined. extending beyond personal healing to encompass all of creation. If word of such abilities ever reached the outside world, he knew with cold certainty that his peaceful exile would come to an abrupt end. That afternoon brought an unexpected visitor in the form of Doc Brennan, who arrived on his elderly mare with his familiar black medical bag strapped behind the saddle. The Irish physician was in his 60s now, his beard more grey than brown, but his eyes remained sharp and his manner as direct as ever. "Afternoon, Crane," he called out as he dismounted stiffly. "Thought I'd best check on you after that storm." We had heard tell it was particularly fierce up in these parts. Obadiah felt his pulse quicken as the doctor approached. If anyone would be able to detect the changes in his condition, it would be Brennan, with his trained eye and decades of medical experience. He schooled his features into their usual mask of resigned indifference and prepared to deflect the physician's questions. "Storm passed without much trouble," he said, unconsciously echoing the words he had used with Tommy Bridger. "Lost a few shingles, but nothing serious." Doc Brennan stopped a few feet away and studied Obadiah's face with the intense scrutiny that had made him one of the most respected physicians in the territory. His expression gradually shifted from professional concern to puzzled surprise. "Well, I'll be damned," he said slowly. "Crane, you look like a different man than the one I examined 6 months ago. Colors better, postures straighter, and unless my eyes deceive me, that limp of yours has all but disappeared. What in blazes have you been doing with yourself?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke from a campfire, and Obadiah knew that his answer would determine whether his secret remained safe or whether the first crack would appear. In the wall of isolation he had so carefully constructed around himself and the miraculous stone. The sacred feather appeared at dawn on the 5th day, resting on the windowsill of Obadiah's cabin as if placed there by invisible hands. It was from a red-tailed hawk, its russet and cream patterns pristine despite the recent storm, and it seemed to glow with the same soft inner light that emanated from the stone. When Obadiah picked it up, a sense of profound peace settled over him, as if he were being watched and protected by forces beyond his understanding. Doc Brennan had stayed the night, his medical curiosity overriding his usual reluctance to impose on Obadiah's solitude. The physician had spent the evening conducting a thorough examination, checking pulse and breathing, testing reflexes and muscle strength, all while maintaining a stream of increasingly bewildered commentary about the remarkable improvements in his patient's condition. In 30 years of practice, Brennan had declared while packing his instruments, "I've never seen anything like it. 6 months ago, you were showing clear signs of advancing arthritis, chronic inflammation, and what I suspected might be early signs of consumption. Now your lungs are clear, your joints move like those of a man half your age, and your overall vitality is extraordinary." Obadiah had deflected the doctor's questions with vague references to improved diet and more regular exercise, but he could see that Brennan remained deeply skeptical of such simple explanations. The physician was far too experienced to accept miraculous recoveries without demanding concrete causes. Now, as morning light revealed the mysterious feather, Obadiah wondered if it might be a sign from Standing Bear's spirit, an indication that his journey toward healing was being guided by powers older and wiser than human understanding. He tucked the feather inside his shirt beside the stone, feeling its soft warmth against his skin. Doc Brennan emerged from the cabin with his characteristic morning gruffness, but his manner sharpened when he noticed Obadiah examining something in his palm. "What's that you've got there, Crane?" "Just a feather," Obadiah replied, slipping it quickly from sight. "Hawk dropped it during the storm, I reckon." The doctor's eyes narrowed slightly, but he made no further comment about the feather. Instead, he turned his attention to his horse and the journey back to town. As he prepared to mount his mare, however, he paused and fixed Obadiah with a penetrating stare. "I don't know what's happened to you up here," he said slowly, "but I want you to know that people are starting to take notice. Tommy Bridges been telling anyone who'll listen about the strange lights he saw during the storm. Add that to your miraculous recovery, and folks are going to start drawing conclusions. Obadiah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. What kind of conclusions? The kind that bring unwanted visitors to your door. Brennan replied grimly, "There's talk in the saloons about miracle cures and supernatural happenings. Word has a way of traveling, especially when it concerns something people desperately want to believe in. You'd best be prepared for company, and not all of it friendly." After the doctor departed, Obadiah spent the morning in troubled contemplation. He had been so focused on the personal transformation the stone was working within him that he had failed to consider the broader implications of his healing. In the harsh frontier territory, where medical care was scarce and death came easily, news of miraculous recoveries would spread like wildfire. That evening, as he sat beside his fire reading Standing Bear's journal, the sacred feather began to glow more brightly. The stone in his pocket responded with its own increased luminosity, and suddenly the air around him shimmered with the same otherworldly quality he had experienced during his dreams. But this was no dream. Sarah stood beside his chair as clearly as she had in life, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. Her touch carried no chill of death, only the familiar warmth he remembered from their years together. When he looked up at her face, he saw not the anguish of her final moments, but the serene beauty of a spirit at peace. "My dearest love," she said, her voice carrying across the years with perfect clarity, "you've carried our pain far longer than you should have. Beth and I have been waiting for you to understand that love doesn't end with death. It simply changes form." Beside her, little Beth appeared as Obadiah had never seen her, not as the frightened child who had died in the fire, but as the young woman she would have become. Her spirit radiated the same gentle wisdom that had always marked her character, now refined by whatever journey she had traveled in the realm beyond life. "Papa," she said, using the childhood name that still had the power to break his heart, "the stone chose you because your love for us was so strong it became a prison. But prisons can be opened from the inside if you have the courage to turn. The key!" Obadiah reached toward them with trembling hands, but his fingers passed through empty air. Still he could feel their presence as surely as if they were flesh and blood, and their words carried the weight of absolute truth. "The choice before you now," Sarah continued, "is not between remembering and forgetting, but between hiding and healing. The stone's power grows stronger when it's shared with those who need it most. You can keep it secret and help only yourself, or you can risk everything to become what you were always meant to be." "What was I meant to be?" Obadiah whispered. Beth smiled with an expression of infinite love. "A healer, Papa. A bridge between the broken and the whole, between despair and hope. The fire that took our bodies couldn't touch our spirits, but your guilt has kept us bound to this world when we should be free to continue our journey. Only by helping others can you finally let us go." As their forms began to fade, Sarah leaned down and pressed her lips to his forehead in a kiss that felt as real as any she had given him in life. "We love you, Obadiah Crane," she whispered. "We always have and we always will. Now it's time for you to love yourself enough to do what must be done." The vision dissolved, leaving Obadiah alone with the crackling fire and the weight of a choice that would determine not only his own fate, but the destiny of everyone the stone's power might touch. Outside, the mountain wind carried the scent of approaching weather, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out in the darkness, a sound that might have been a warning, or perhaps a blessing. The revelation came through Standing Bear's journal on the 6th morning, hidden in passages that Obadiah had previously overlooked in his focus on understanding the stone's healing properties. As he read by the warm glow emanating from the sacred object, the true magnitude of his situation began to unfold like a map revealing treacherous territory ahead. The stone in his possession was not unique. It was one of 7 sacred artifacts scattered across the frontier territories by ancient shamans who had foreseen the coming of European settlers and the disruption their presence would bring to the spiritual balance of the land. Each stone contained the concentrated essence of healing power, but they were designed to work in concert, their individual abilities enhanced when other stones were brought together. Standing Bear's writings revealed that he had been part of a network of guardians, each responsible for protecting one of the sacred stones until the time came for them to be reunited. But that time had never arrived. One by one, the other guardians had died, taking the locations of their stones to their graves. Some had been lost in the chaos of war and westward expansion, while others had fallen into the hands of those who sought to exploit their power for personal gain. Most disturbing of all was Standing Bear's account of a man named Jeremiah Cross, a collector of supernatural artifacts who had spent decades tracking down sacred objects throughout the territories. Cross was described as ruthless and cunning, a man who would stop at nothing to possess items of mystical significance. According to the journal, he had already murdered at least 3 stone guardians, taking their artifacts and leaving a trail of death in his wake. The journal's final entries, written in Standing Bear's weakening hand as disease claimed his life, contained urgent warnings about Cross's continued activities. The man had somehow learned about the network of sacred stones and was methodically hunting down each guardian. Standing Bear had hidden his stone within the very structure of the cabin, weaving protective spells around it, but he knew that Cross would eventually find his way to this remote mountain sanctuary. "The man who comes after me," one passage read, "must understand that possessing the stone makes him a target. Cross has eyes and ears throughout the territories, and news of miraculous healings will draw him like a wolf to fresh meat. The bearer must be prepared not only to protect the stone, but to decide whether its power is worth the cost of the lives that will be endangered by its presence." Obadiah set down the journal with hands that trembled slightly. The miraculous healing he had experienced, the restoration of his vitality and hope, might well have signed his death warrant. If this Jeremiah Cross was still alive and still hunting sacred artifacts, then the lights Tommy Bridger had seen during the storm, combined with Doc Brennan's amazement at Obadiah's recovery, would create exactly the kind of trail the collector would follow. His contemplation was interrupted by the discovery of another artifact hidden within the journal's leather binding. As he examined the worn cover more closely, his fingers found a concealed pocket that contained a bone knife, its handle carved with the same mysterious symbols that adorned the stone. The moment he touched the blade, it began to glow with a cold blue light that was distinctly different from the stone's warm radiance. Standing Bear's notes identified this as a warning device, crafted to detect the approach of those who harbored evil intentions toward the sacred artifacts. The knife would remain dark in the presence of ordinary people, but would blaze with protective light when danger drew near. As if summoned by his discovery of the blade, a new presence made itself known in the clearing around his cabin. It began as nothing more than a feeling, the sense of being watched by unseen eyes. The forest, which had been alive with the normal sounds of birds and small animals, fell unnaturally silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, leaving the mountain peak wrapped in an ominous stillness. The bone knife in Obadiah's hand began to pulse with increasingly urgent light, and he knew with cold certainty that his fears were being realized. Somewhere below, moving up the treacherous mountain paths with the patience of an experienced hunter, Jeremiah Cross was approaching. Obadiah moved to the cabin's single window and peered down into the valley. There, perhaps a mile away but climbing steadily, he could see a small party of horsemen picking their way along the narrow trail. Even at this distance, something about their purposeful advance sent ice through his veins. These were not casual travelers or friendly visitors. They moved with the focused intensity of predators closing in on prey. Through the spyglass he kept for watching weather patterns, Obadiah was able to make out details that confirmed his worst fears. The leader of the group was a tall, lean man dressed in black, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, but his posture radiating an aura of cold authority. Behind him rode 4 other men, all armed with rifles and displaying the hard-eyed alertness of professional killers. But it was what the leader carried that filled Obadiah with true dread. Strapped to his saddle was a leather case that seemed to pulse with its own dark energy, and even from this great distance, the sacred stone in Obadiah's pocket began to vibrate with what felt like fear or rage. Whatever was contained in that case, it had once been sacred, but was now corrupted, twisted into something that perverted the very purpose for which it had been created. The bone knife's glow intensified to the point where Obadiah had to shield his eyes, and suddenly he understood its true purpose. This was not merely a warning device. It was a weapon designed specifically to defend the sacred stones against those who would misuse their power. The blade thrummed with energy that seemed eager to taste the blood of those who had perverted the gifts of the spirits. As evening approached, the party below made camp in a sheltered grove about half a mile from the base of the final ascent, to Obadiah's sanctuary. Through his spyglass, he could see them moving with the practiced efficiency of men who had done this many times before. They built their fire small and smokeless, posted guards in positions that commanded clear views of all approaches, and settled in to wait for dawn. Jeremiah Cross stood apart from his men, his attention focused on the leather case he had opened beside his bedroll. From within it, he withdrew objects that made the sacred stone burn cold against Obadiah's chest. Other artifacts that had once been sources of healing and hope, now darkened by their association with violence and greed. A crystal that should have glowed with pure light, now pulsed with sickly red illumination. A medicine bundle that had once brought peace to troubled spirits, writhed with shadows that seemed to have lives of their own. Most horrifying of all was what appeared to be another sacred stone, but one whose light had been utterly corrupted. Where Obadiah's artifact pulsed with warm, golden radiance, this stone burned with cold blue fire that hurt to look upon. It had been twisted somehow, its healing power transformed into something that fed on pain rather than alleviating it. Cross held this perverted stone up toward the mountain peak where Obadiah's cabin sat, and even from this great distance, Obadiah could feel its malevolent influence pressing against his consciousness like a physical weight. The man below was not just a collector of sacred artifacts. He was someone who had learned to corrupt their very essence, turning tools of healing into instruments of torment. As full darkness settled over the mountains, Obadiah realized that the choice Sarah and Beth's spirits had presented to him was about to be taken out of his hands. Tomorrow, Jeremiah Cross would climb to his sanctuary, and when he arrived, there would be no more hiding, no more pretending that the stone's power could remain secret. The bone knife pulsed urgently in his grip, and Obadiah understood that he faced the most important decision of his life. He could flee into the wilderness, taking the stone with him and hoping to escape Cross's pursuit. Or he could stay and fight, using the sacred artifact's power to defend not just himself, but the very nature of healing itself against those who would corrupt it for their own dark purposes. Outside, a hawk cried out in the darkness, the same species that had provided the sacred feather now resting against his heart. It might have been coincidence, or it might have been Standing Bear's spirit offering one final piece of guidance to the man who had inherited his sacred trust. The spirit mirror revealed itself to Obadiah in the darkest hour before dawn, emerging from the same hidden compartment in Standing Bear's journal where he had discovered the bone knife. The mirror was no larger than a man's palm, its surface made of obsidian, polished to perfect smoothness by hands that had worked stone when the world was younger. Unlike ordinary mirrors that reflected physical appearance, this sacred artifact showed the true nature of whoever gazed into its depths, When Obadiah looked upon his own reflection, he saw not the weathered face of a mountain hermit, but the gentle spirit of a man finally learning to forgive himself. Golden light surrounded his image, pulsing in rhythm with the stone's healing energy. But when he turned the mirror toward the camp below, the obsidian surface revealed horrors that made his blood run cold. Jeremiah Cross appeared as a figure, wreathed in shadows, his form distorted by the malevolent energy he had absorbed from corrupted sacred artifacts. Dark tendrils writhed around him like living smoke, and his eyes burned with an unholy hunger that spoke of decades spent feeding on others' spiritual power. The 4 men who followed him were revealed to be more than mere hired killers. Each bore the spiritual scars of those who had willingly participated in the desecration of sacred objects. Their souls showed as twisted, blackened things, corrupted by association with Cross's evil work. These were men who had helped murder other guardians, who had watched without protest as healing artifacts were perverted into instruments of torment. Through the spirit mirror, Obadiah could see Cross examining a detailed map of the mountain region, marking off locations with methodical precision. The man had been tracking him for months, using a network of informants to piece together reports of strange lights and miraculous healings. Doc Brennan's amazement at Obadiah's recovery, Tommy Bridges' tales of supernatural illumination during the storm. Every detail had been carefully noted and analyzed. As dawn approached, Obadiah made his preparations with the grim efficiency of a man who had once been a soldier. The stone's power had not only healed his body, but had awakened memories and skills he had thought lost to time. His hands moved with practiced certainty as he gathered the sacred artifacts: the glowing stone, the bone knife, the spirit mirror, the sacred feather, and Sarah's wedding ring with its mysterious connection to the realm of memory. Standing Bear's journal provided detailed instructions for a ritual that could unite all the sacred objects into a protective barrier around the cabin. The ceremony required precise timing, specific words in the ancient Shoshone tongue, and most importantly, absolute faith in the power of healing to overcome corruption. But even as he prepared the ritual circle according to the journal's diagrams, Obadiah found himself wrestling with profound doubts. The gentle dreams and visions he had experienced over the past week had filled him with peace and hope, but they had not prepared him for the reality of facing true evil. Cross was not simply a man who collected sacred artifacts. He was someone who had spent decades learning to corrupt their very essence, turning tools of healing into weapons of spiritual destruction. The sacred feather grew warm against his chest as the sun crested the eastern peaks, and suddenly Sarah's presence filled the cabin once more. She appeared not as the peaceful spirit who had visited him before, but as the fierce protector he remembered from their early days together, the woman who had once faced down a rattlesnake to protect young Beth, who had stood her ground against drunken cowboys who thought a blacksmith's wife would be an easy target. "My love," she said, her voice carrying the steel that had first made him fall in love with her strength. "You've spent 20 years believing you failed to protect us. Now, you have the chance to protect something far greater, the very power that brought us back together." Beth appeared beside her mother, no longer the child who had died in the fire, but the young woman she would have become. Her spirit blazed with righteous anger as she gestured toward the approaching danger. "Papa, that man below has murdered guardians whose only crime was protecting sources of healing. He's turned sacred stones into things that feed on suffering. If you don't stop him here, he'll continue until every source of spiritual power in the territories has been corrupted or destroyed." Obadiah felt the weight of their words settling over him like a mantle of responsibility. This was no longer about his personal healing or even his family's peace. It was about the fundamental battle between forces that sought to heal the world and those that sought to exploit its pain for personal gain. "What am I supposed to do?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm one man against 5, and I've never used the stone's power as a weapon." "The stone doesn't need to be a weapon," Sarah replied gently. "Its power comes from love, from the desire to heal rather than harm. But sometimes healing requires cutting away corruption, just as a surgeon must remove diseased flesh to save a patient's life." As their spirits faded with the growing daylight, Obadiah turned his attention to the final preparations. According to Standing Bear's notes, the ritual of protection would create a barrier that no one with evil intentions could cross. But it would also transform him in ways he couldn't predict, binding him permanently to the stone's power and making him a target for every corrupt collector who learned of his abilities. The sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed off the canyon walls as Cross and his men began their final ascent. Through the spirit mirror, Obadiah could see them moving with the confidence of predators who had never encountered effective resistance. Cross rode at the front, his corrupted stone pulsing with dark energy, while his men spread out to surround the cabin. Obadiah placed the sacred objects in the pattern Standing Bear had prescribed. The stone at the center, surrounded by the other artifacts at precise intervals that corresponded to the cardinal directions and the 3 realms of earth, sky, and spirit. As he began to speak the ancient words, the objects began to resonate with increasing power, their individual lights blending into a harmonious glow that filled the cabin with warmth. But even as the protective ritual took shape around him, Obadiah could feel Cross's corrupted power pressing against the barrier like acid eating at clean metal. The man below was not simply a collector. He was someone who had learned to weaponize spiritual energy, turning the very foundations of sacred power against themselves. The bone knife in Obadiah's hand began to vibrate with increasing urgency. As the riders drew closer, through its warning pulse, he could sense the approach of not just physical danger, but spiritual corruption on a scale he had never imagined. Cross carried with him the perverted essence of multiple sacred artifacts, their healing power transformed into something that fed on pain and despair. As the protective circle reached its full strength, Obadiah felt the stone's power flowing through him in ways that transcended his previous experiences. He was no longer simply a man who possessed a healing artifact. He had become a conduit for forces that stretched back to the very foundations of the world's spiritual balance. But with that power came terrible knowledge. Through the stone's enhanced awareness, he could perceive the full extent of Cross's corruption. The man below had not simply stolen sacred artifacts. He had learned to corrupt their guardians as well, turning protectors into willing accomplices in the desecration of their own sacred trusts. The 4 men who rode with him had once been guardians themselves, their spirits twisted by prolonged exposure to perverted power until they became willing servants of the very evil they had once opposed. The spirit mirror showed him glimpses of Cross's previous victories. Stone circles turned into places of torment, medicine bundles used to spread disease rather than cure it, healing springs poisoned by corrupted artifacts until they became sources of madness and despair. Each victory had made Cross stronger, adding to his collection of perverted power while leaving behind a trail of spiritual devastation that would take generations to heal. Now Cross had come for the stone that had given Obadiah back his family, his hope, and his purpose. The man intended not just to steal the artifact, but to corrupt it as he had all the others, turning its healing light into another source of spiritual darkness. The sound of boots on the wooden steps of his porch announced that the moment of confrontation had finally arrived. Obadiah stood in the center of his protective circle, the sacred artifacts blazing with combined power around him, and prepared to face an enemy who represented everything opposed to the healing force that had transformed his life. Cross's voice carried through the cabin door, cultured, confident, and utterly without warmth. "Mr. Crane, I believe you have something that belongs to me. I suggest you open the door and discuss terms like civilized men. I have no desire to damage the artifact through unnecessary violence, but I will have it one way or another." The bone knife pulsed with urgent warning as the door handle began to turn, and Obadiah realized that his 20 years of self-imposed exile had been merely preparation for this moment, the final test of whether healing power could triumph over the forces that sought to corrupt it. Outside, the morning sun climbed higher over the mountain peaks, and somewhere in the distance a hawk cried out, a sound that might have been a battle cry, or perhaps a prayer for the courage to do what must be done. The thunderstick revealed itself the moment Jeremiah Cross stepped across the threshold of Obadiah's sanctuary. What had appeared to be an ordinary wooden staff leaning against the cabin's far wall suddenly blazed with the same golden light that emanated from the sacred stone, its surface crackling with energy that seemed to hunger for righteous battle. Cross paused in the doorway, his pale eyes taking in the protective circle of artifacts, and the figure of Obadiah standing at their center. Up close, the man was even more disturbing than the spirit mirror had revealed. His face held the refined features of someone born to wealth and education, but his eyes were empty of everything that made a person human. They were the eyes of a predator that had fed so long on others' spiritual essence that it had forgotten what it meant to possess a soul. "Impressive," Cross said, his voice carrying the cultured tones of Eastern education. "Standing Bear's protective circle, if I'm not mistaken. I encountered a similar arrangement in Colorado Territory 3 years ago. The Guardian thought his ritual would protect him as well." He smiled, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp. He was mistaken. Obadiah's hand closed around the thunder stick, and immediately he felt Standing Bear's presence flowing through the ancient wood. The shaman's spirit had not departed with his death, but had bound itself to this final weapon, waiting for the moment when it would be needed to defend the sacred artifacts against ultimate corruption. "You won't find me as easy to overcome as your previous victims," Obadiah said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through his veins. "This stone chose me for a reason." Cross laughed, a sound like wind through a graveyard. "They all believe that, old man. Every Guardian thinks his artifact makes him special, chosen, protected by powers beyond mortal understanding, but sacred. Power is like any other force. It can be redirected, corrupted, made to serve new masters." He gestured to his men, who had positioned themselves around the cabin's perimeter. Each carried weapons that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Guns and blades that had been blessed by corrupted artifacts until they became instruments of spiritual as well as physical destruction. "The stone you possess is the 6th I have claimed," Cross continued, his pale eyes fixed on the glowing artifact at the center of Obadiah's protective circle. "When combined with the others, it will complete a set of power that will make me master of every sacred site in the territories. No healing spring will flow without my permission, no medicine bundle will work without paying tribute to my collection." The thunderstick pulsed with increasing energy as Cross's intentions became clear. This was not simply about possessing the sacred stone. It was about creating a monopoly on spiritual power itself, turning every source of healing in the American territories into another tool for the man's dominance and control. Obadiah raised the staff, and immediately the cabin filled with defensive energy. Barriers of golden light sprang up around the protective circle, creating a fortress of sacred power that made Cross's men step back in alarm. But Cross himself merely smiled and withdrew his own corrupted stone from its leather case. The moment the perverted artifact came into view, the very air in the cabin seemed to darken. Where Obadiah's stone pulsed with warm, healing light, Cross's artifact burned with cold fire that seemed to devour hope itself. The two stones recognized each other as fundamental opposites, one dedicated to healing, the other corrupted into an instrument of spiritual destruction. "Do you feel that?" Cross asked, holding his stone toward the protective barrier. "The hunger of perverted power? I've spent 15 years learning to corrupt sacred artifacts, turning their healing essence into something far more useful. Your stone wants to heal. Mine feeds on suffering. Guess which one is stronger in a world full of pain? The corrupted stone pulsed with malevolent energy, and immediately Obadiah felt his protective barriers beginning to weaken. This was power turned inside out. Healing transformed into harm, hope perverted into despair. Against such fundamental corruption, even Standing Bear's ancient protections were beginning to falter. But as the barriers wavered, something unexpected happened. The other artifacts in Obadiah's circle, Sarah's wedding ring, the sacred feather, the spirit mirror, even the pressed flowers from his Bible, began to resonate with increasing power. These were not just random objects touched by the stone's influence, but anchors to the most fundamental force in creation, love that refused to die, connection that transcended death itself. The thunderstick blazed in Obadiah's hands as he finally understood the true nature of the battle before him. This was not a contest between two different kinds of power, but between two different ways of relating to power itself. Cross sought to possess and control sacred energy, to bend it to his will through force and corruption. But true sacred power could never be owned. It could only be channeled by those humble enough to serve rather than command. Cross's smile faded as he realized that his usual tactics were failing. The protective circle was not weakening, but transforming, drawing strength from sources he had never learned to corrupt, the simple, enduring love between human souls that formed the foundation of all true healing. The healing circle manifested around Obadiah with such sudden power that even Cross stepped back in alarm. 7 points of brilliant light appeared in the air around the cabin, each one representing one of the sacred stones scattered across the territories. Though the physical artifacts remained hidden or corrupted, their spiritual essence responded to the call of their untainted brother, creating a barrier of healing energy unlike anything the world had seen since the ancient days. Cross's corrupted stone writhed in his grip like a living thing in pain, its dark fire flickering as it encountered power it could not pervert or control. For the first time since entering the cabin, uncertainty flickered across the collector's refined features. His other corrupted artifacts, spread throughout his camp below, began to emit discordant wails as their perverted energy was challenged by something far more fundamental. Impossible, Cross whispered, his cultured voice cracking for the first time. I've spent decades learning to corrupt sacred power. Nothing can stand against artifacts that have been willingly turned to darkness. But the healing circle expanded beyond the confines of the cabin, embracing not just Obadiah, but Cross and his men as well. The spiritual energy that flowed from the 7 points of light was not the aggressive force Cross had expected. It was something far more dangerous to his corrupted nature. It was compassion given form, understanding made manifest, forgiveness offered freely to even the most twisted souls. Cross's men cried out in terror as the healing light touched them, but their fear quickly transformed into something far more profound. The spiritual scars that marked their souls, the accumulated damage of years spent participating in the corruption of sacred artifacts, began to dissolve under the circle's influence. For the first time in decades, they remembered what it felt like to experience hope without the bitter aftertaste of exploitation. The leader of Cross's hired killers, a man named Sullivan, whose own family had been murdered by bandits 20 years earlier, fell to his knees as the healing light reached him. The rage and thirst for vengeance that had driven him to Cross's service melted away, replaced by memories of love and loss that he had buried beneath layers of violence and corruption. "What is this?" he gasped, staring at his hands as if seeing them clearly for the first time in years. "What's happening to us?" "Healing," Obadiah replied, his voice carrying the authority of Standing Bear's ancient wisdom. "The kind that reaches deeper than flesh and bone, down to the very foundations of who you are." One by one, Cross's other men experienced similar transformations, Years of spiritual corruption began to unravel as the healing circle worked its profound magic, not by forcing change upon them, but by offering them the chance to remember who they had been before they chose the path of exploitation and violence. Cross himself fought against the circle's influence with desperate fury, his corrupted stone blazing with increasingly frantic energy. But even his perverted artifact could not stand indefinitely against the combined spiritual force of 7 sacred stones working in harmony. The dark fire that had burned within his stone for years began to flicker and dim, its corrupted power slowly being cleansed by exposure to authentic healing energy. "No," Cross snarled, his refined facade cracking to reveal the desperate hunger beneath. "I will not be denied. I have worked too long and sacrificed too much to be stopped by some mountain hermit and his misguided notions of redemption." He raised his stone high above his head, preparing to channel its remaining corrupted power into one final assault on the healing circle. But as he did so, something unexpected happened. Visions began to flood his consciousness, not the twisted memories he had cultivated over years of spiritual corruption, but genuine recollections from his own past. He saw himself as a young man, studying theology in a Boston seminary, his heart full of genuine desire to serve something greater than himself. He remembered the moment when he first encountered a sacred artifact, a healing crystal brought back from the frontier by a missionary friend. The power it contained had filled him with awe and wonder, and he had dedicated himself to finding others like it. But somewhere along the way, his desire to study sacred power had transformed into a need to possess it. The first guardian he had murdered, an elderly Lakota medicine man who had refused to surrender his tribe's sacred bundle, had been justified in Cross's mind as necessary for the greater good of preserving ancient knowledge. Each subsequent corruption had been easier to rationalize, until he had lost all connection to the man who had once genuinely sought to serve the divine. Now, surrounded by the healing circle's compassionate energy, Cross experienced the full weight of what he had become. The tears that ran down his face were not born of self-pity, but of genuine recognition of the countless lives he had destroyed in pursuit of power that was never meant to be possessed. His corrupted stone fell from nerveless fingers, its dark fire finally extinguished by the simple power of authentic remorse. As it struck the cabin floor, the artifact cracked into 7 pieces, each one beginning to glow with the same golden light that emanated from Obadiah's sacred stone. The healing circle pulsed with renewed strength, and Cross understood that his years of corruption were finally at an end. The memory stone lay in Obadiah's palm 3 months later, its surface now clear as mountain crystal, but retaining the gentle warmth that had first marked it as something beyond ordinary understanding. The mysterious symbols that had once covered its surface had faded, not through any loss of power, but through the completion of its intended purpose. Where once it had pulsed with urgent healing energy, now it radiated the quiet contentment of work well done. Jeremiah Cross had departed the mountain a transformed man, his refined features softened by genuine humility, and his pale eyes finally holding the warmth of someone who had remembered how to feel compassion. The corrupted artifacts he had collected over decades of spiritual predation were either destroyed or returned to their rightful guardians, their dark power cleansed by exposure to authentic healing energy. His former associates had scattered to the winds, each carrying within them the seeds of redemption that would guide them toward better lives. Sullivan had returned to his family's abandoned homestead in Kansas, determined to rebuild not just the farm his grief had driven him to abandon, but the man he had been before loss twisted him toward violence. The others had similar journeys ahead of them, each one now free to choose healing over harm, service over exploitation. Doc Brennan arrived at the cabin on a crisp October morning, his familiar black bag replaced by a leather satchel that contained Not just medical instruments, but careful notes about the miraculous healings he had witnessed throughout the territory. Word of what had transpired on Eagle Peak had spread despite Obadiah's efforts to maintain privacy, and now the Irish physician found himself serving as guide to a steady stream of pilgrims seeking the mountain hermit's wisdom. "You've become quite famous, Crane," Brennan said with gruff affection as he accepted a cup of coffee on the cabin's porch. "Half the territory's talking about the healer of the high country. And can't say I blame them. I've seen things in the past few months that would have been impossible before that business with Cross and his corrupted stones." Obadiah nodded thoughtfully, his gaze fixed on the valley below, where the first snows of winter were beginning to dust the lower peaks. The decision he had wrestled with for months was finally crystallizing into certainty, shaped by countless conversations with the spirits of Sarah and Beth, and by the gradual understanding of his true purpose. "The stone's work here is finished," he said quietly, holding up the transformed crystal. "It's time for me to take what I've learned back to the world." That evening, as he packed his few possessions and prepared to abandon the sanctuary that had sheltered him for 20 years, Sarah and Beth appeared to him one final time. They stood bathed in the golden light of sunset streaming through the cabin's western window, their forms more radiant and peaceful than he had ever seen them. "We're ready to go now," Sarah said, her voice carrying the joy of someone finally free to continue an interrupted journey. "You've learned to forgive yourself, and that was the only chain that bound us to this world." Beth stepped forward. No longer the frightened child who had died in the fire, but the wise young woman she had become through her spiritual journey. "The stone chose you not just to heal your own wounds, Papa, but to show others that healing is always possible, no matter how deep the hurt goes." Obadiah felt tears streaming down his weathered cheeks as he realized this would be their final goodbye. But there was no sadness in the moment, only profound gratitude for the gift they had given him and the peace they had found together. "I love you both," he whispered, "more than all the words in all the languages ever spoken." "And we love you," Sarah replied. "But love doesn't end with goodbye. It just changes form. Every person you help heal, every wounded soul you guide toward. Forgiveness will be us loving the world through you." As their forms began to fade, Beth smiled with an expression of infinite tenderness. "Take care of the broken ones, Papa. They need you most of all." The morning of his departure dawned clear and cold, with fresh snow dusting the mountain peaks, like blessing from above. Obadiah loaded his few possessions onto the sturdy mule Tommy Bridger had brought up from the valley, then took one last look around the cabin that had been his home for 2 decades. Standing Bear's journal would remain here, hidden once more within the cabin's structure for whatever future guardian might need its wisdom. The protective circle had been carefully dismantled, its energy returned to the natural balance of the mountain. But the healing power the stone had awakened within him would travel wherever he went, ready to serve those who needed it most. The trail down from Eagle Peak seemed shorter than he remembered, perhaps because he was no longer a man fleeing from life, but someone walking toward it with purpose and hope. By evening he had reached Millbrook, where news of his arrival spread quickly through the small frontier community. In the months that followed, Obadiah established himself not as some mystical healer, but as a counselor and guide, someone who understood the deepest wounds of the human heart and knew how to help others find their own paths to healing. The memory stone served as a focus for his work, helping troubled souls access their own capacity for forgiveness and growth. Years later, when curious visitors asked him about the source of his remarkable insights into human nature, Obadiah would simply smile and touch the crystal pendant that hung around his neck. Some gifts, he would say, were too precious to be explained. They could only be shared with those ready to receive them. And somewhere in the realm beyond mortal understanding, the spirits of Sarah and Beth watched over their beloved husband and father as he continued the work of healing that love had made possible.